here comes the 4-day work week. Well, I mean, at least if you live in Japan and if you work for Microsoft and if you were taking part in doing both in August. Nonetheless, really interesting news. Apparently, the company, Microsoft, had performed a trial run back in August called the Work Life Choice Challenge. Now, what it did and what that meant is that basically Microsoft would shut down its offices every Friday and give employees all an extra day off. Hmm. Now, you might be thinking, insanity. How are they going to function? What's going to happen if employees do not spend every single working moment at work? What's going to happen? Well, apparently, you're going to gain productivity. No, I'm not kidding. It turns out that productivity measured by sales per employee at the specific place in Japan at Microsoft actually went up. And it didn't just go up slightly, it actually went up by almost half, 40%. What is going on? Now, that's compared to the same period the previous year. And that's when they were running 5 days a week. Now, how's that possible? Well, look, for one, they actually did some interesting measures that I think make perfect sense for businesses. For one, managers cut down the time spent in meetings. Look, you spend time in meetings, like you get meetings like an hour, a half hour, a month, or a week, whatever. Well, that does cut into productivity, right? You eliminate that or try to reduce the number of meetings and the length of meetings to really important business, and of course, you're going to be more productive. Great. Okay, that makes sense. They also cut down the time people spent responding to emails. Okay. Oh, look, that can, of course, waste a lot of time as well. Um, Not only that, but employees were also encouraged to cut down on meetings altogether by using online messaging. So if you need something or whatever, okay, online message. All right. Hey, that makes sense, right? Now, in return for making things more efficient and productive, they actually ended up getting an extra day off. And so that's great. And there are other benefits, of course. Benefits for obviously the workers. They get an extra day off to spend time with their family and, actually live their lives. That's great. And not only that, but the company also won as well. They have more productive, happier employees. And they actually save money because they didn't have to run on Friday. They actually save money on electricity. Hey, look, this seems like a win-win, right? So now I like it. I love the idea. Right now, weekdays are too long. Weekends are way too short. Work-life balance, let me tell you what, in this field especially, but just like in many others, there is literally no balance. So now, again, what made this very interesting is not only what they did, but also where they did it. Japan is notorious for overworking its employees. In fact, it's more infamous than anything because they have worked their employees literally to death. So now there's actually a word for it, and I didn't know this before. The term is karoshi. Karoshi. You know what that means? It means death by overwork, plainly put. So now it happens, these deaths, mainly due to stress-induced illness or severe depression from working an insane amount of hours and not getting enough rest and not getting enough time to themselves or with their families. So it's work, 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 work all the time. Well, of course, you're not going to have any time to do the things that make you happy. And so, of course, uh, we've had stories of people flinging themselves off buildings just in order to get away from the culture of overwork. One example was an employee at a Japanese advertising giant named Dentsu, who died by suicide on Christmas Day. Tokyo officials later said that the staffer had worked excessive amounts of overtime. And so that's really important to point out. Now you could say, wait a minute, it's overtime. Overtime, you get paid more. Not if you're salary. Now, if you're hourly, okay, then you get paid more for overtime. But if you're a salary worker, you're SOL, dude. Sorry about that. And look, the other thing about overtime is some people say, well, isn't that optional? Well, don't, sometimes, of course, they ask you to do overtime. I used to get asked a lot to do overtime when I worked in the factories or, worked in retail. And sometimes I'd take it and sometimes I wouldn't. It would depend on what I needed to do, right? Well, in Japan, a lot of that overtime tends to be mandatory. And even if it's not, there is a lot of societal pressure on these workers to work that overtime, to take those hours. So, I mean, the work culture in Japan is very, very serious. Okay. And you can see the effects of that. So now, um, look, all of this, by the way, it basically there's a huge corporate culture of overwork. Where literally what you're all you're doing is working, sleeping, and eating in between, right? And sometimes employees, and I just saw a recent story on this. We had we saw an employee, a Japanese employee, literally get fined, punished for taking a lunch break just to eat. Come on, man. That's awful. That's ridiculous. All right. So now there's another example of overwork and the toll it costs. And this is a reporter to a Japanese broadcaster who had died after working extremely long hours. Her employer had said that she had clocked in a total of 159 hours of overtime the month before her death. 150. Jesus. So look, this is a big, big problem that happens in Japan. Now, where it gets also more interesting, and especially for an American context, is how it could relate to working conditions in America, right? So now we have this notion of hard work. We're not as bad as the Japanese in that respect, but and also maybe less cultural and more necessity. And so here in America, we have a massive income and wealth disparity problem, right? So we have massive, amazing productivity. However, wages have not kept up to that productivity. And so people are working longer and longer hours. They're grabbing more and more overtime. They're having maybe second or third jobs in order to make ends meet. And so here in America, we have a similar problem of overwork, but not quite to the extent, and also for different reasons. Um, it, and so, look, you have to work to be able to afford rents that are continuing to rise, home prices that have risen, commodity prices that have risen. You also don't get free healthcare, so you have to either have a good job to pay for that, or several jobs to be able to afford health insurance premiums if you're not insured by your employer. And so, all of that stuff, is really, really important. Uh, and so, but the interesting thing is that if Microsoft can do 4-day weeks in Japan with that culture of overwork, why, with a lot of modification to, for example, wages here in America, why couldn't that happen here? And so that's very interesting, right? Now, before that happens, there's of course need to be other changes in place. Because the thing that I worry about from a worker perspective is, okay, so say we have 4-day weeks. Well, then they're just going to, they're either going to increase our hours throughout the week instead of, for example, 40-hour work spaced across 5 days, right? That's a normal week. Well, okay, so they're just going to increase our hours to 12 hours a day for 4 days a week. Well, now that wouldn't be good, right? Because that doesn't do anything to help work-life balance, and I've worked that shift before, and it can be difficult. And the problem is, of course, pay. A lot of people can't afford to take that fifth day off, so they can't afford to only work 4 days a week. So there has to be an increase in wages, especially the minimum wage, if this is to actually be effective. And so that's a real issue, and those are real concerns that do need to be addressed. But at the same time, I think a 4-day work week is wonderful. Is a wonderful idea, and I do give Microsoft credit for actually running this experiment. And by the way, they're going to actually run this again. They're going to do this another time to see if it continues to have the same kind of impact. We continue to see, or they will continue to see, a bigger increase in production and productivity for the days that their workers are working. And so, and look, it's not just them; it's the government of Japan also taking the same initiative, and small businesses in Japan doing the same thing. So, if we could start looking into ways to do that here, well, that would be really, really important in redressing the work-life balance and making sure that workers are productive, happy, as well as being able to make the bills. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent progressive media.